Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Kaitlyn Greenidge's exclusive Scribd Originals short story, Orgy, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after over 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors like Kaitlyn, we wouldn't be here today, and we are truly appreciative of it. So a brief housekeeping note before we begin. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Nicole Cliffe will not be able to moderate tonight's event, and I will be stepping in her stead, should such a thing be possible. That said, we're excited to be partnering with Scribd to present Kaitlyn Greenidge's short story, Orgy, tonight. Scribd Originals is a program featuring ambitious, original fiction and nonfiction, available exclusively on Scribd. These vivid, compelling stories, which can often be read in just a few hours, span a range of genres: narrative journalism, literary fiction, memoir, thrillers, mysteries, true crime, sci-fi, and narrative history. Scribd is the unlimited reading subscription service that offers access to the best books, audiobooks, news and magazine articles, documents, and more. Scribd is available on iOS and Android devices, as well as web browsers, and hosts more than 100 million readers across the globe every month. For more information, you can visit Scribd.com and follow @Scribd on Twitter and Instagram. Kaitlyn Greenidge's debut novel, We Love You, Charlie Freeman, was one of the New York Times critics' top 10 books of 2016. Her writing has appeared in Vogue, Glamour, The Wall Street Journal, Elle, BuzzFeed, Transition Magazine, Virginia Quarterly Review, The Believer, and American Short Fiction, among others. She is the recipient of fellowships from the Whiting Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University, and the Guggenheim Foundation. She's currently features director at Harper's Bazaar, as well as a contributing writer for the New York Times. Her second novel, Liberty, published by Algonquin Books, is out now. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kaitlyn to the stage.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you for everyone in the audience for coming. I'm really overwhelmed and bowled over to see so many people excited to talk about a piece of short fiction on a Thursday night. It's just really warms my heart and makes me really excited. So thank you for coming, and thank you for having me.
Oh, please. It is our honor to have you. And I echo our thanks to the audience. As a slight warning, since we are discussing a short story, it will be hard to avoid spoilers. So just be aware of that as you're listening, that we will be straying into that territory. And I think we're going to begin with a reading by Kaitlyn and then get into the discussion.
Great. So I'm gonna read actually from a different part of the story than we talked about in the beginning. I had a change of heart halfway through, and so I'm gonna read from. So the story is called Orgy. The main character is named Nessa. She's headed to an orgy that her ex-girlfriend's new girlfriend has invited her to, and so I'm gonna read from when she gets on the bus, and the story takes place in June of last year. So that's some of the context clues I think that you need for this. On the bus, Nessa doesn't sit down. She finds a crumpled Whole Foods napkin in her jacket pocket and wraps it around the pole. A woman is seated at the back of the bus, dressed in swaths of faded, thick black cotton, a ski mask pulled over her face despite the June heat. She's quietly, fervently talking to herself. At the front are 3 high school girls who blithely sit on the seats without caring. Nessa watches them with a pang, thinking of Fatima. The girls catch Nessa looking at them and burst out laughing. "What the fuck is your problem?" she says, and then she catches herself in the black of the bus window. She's in her costume from the orgy, the heavy lashes, the pig's nose peeking over the mask, and she starts laughing too. And now there's a jolly camaraderie between them that makes Nessa even more hopeful for the night. Other than that, the bus is empty, and after the girls turn away to look at their phones, Nessa is left alone to think about the orgy. The invite had said it was an old-fashioned orgy, but she'd read a bit further and saw it was co-hosted by a furry triad that her friend Marsha's girlfriend knows. The invite didn't specifically say costumes were required, but Nessa congratulates herself for reading between the lines. She watches her reflection in the window and the city streams behind it. The office towers are dark, and so are some of the restaurants. But on the block up ahead, she can see people eating at tables set up on the sidewalk, and she feels a flash of jealousy and that sad rage again. She has not eaten out at a restaurant since March. Neither has Lori, her roommate, and they sit together at the kitchen table, often feeling superior. But the truth of it is, Nessa has no one to eat at a restaurant with anymore. When she sends out texts asking, people push her off. A walk in the park? They ask. They text back. Then she sees them post from cafes on Instagram. She is so many people's third-tier friend, not worth the risk of sharing a restaurant meal with. It is a cold reckoning at the end of the world. She squeezes her eyes shut. She can feel herself start to hyperventilate between the heat of the mask and the irritation of the pig's snout. She wants to tear the mask off. She tries to breathe in out slowly. She focuses on what she is most looking forward to this night. The secret parts of a body that no one seems to talk about, even in the most profane of songs. The balls, for instance. She misses reaching into a too tight pair of jeans or underneath a short and shiny miniskirt and encountering them, amorphous like jelly, then slowly tightening the longer her hand stays. You can say each dick tastes different, but she adores how every ball sack tastes the same. The skin too fragile but suddenly tough when aroused. The smell of human musk that could have come from an armpit or the back of an ear. The way the hair there flat and wet against her tongue. Really, why did no one speak of it? She misses fisting somebody and watching their breasts tremble. She misses the deep, rippling black of nipples. She misses pussies. That's it, just pussies. They are glorious enough in their existence. They don't need any more rhapsodies. She misses rolling out of bed or straightening up in a toilet stall and smelling gloriously ripe and human. She misses it all. But worse would be feeling no desire at all. She knows it is petty and selfish and small to think it, but this is the worst this year has done, taken away all her yearning. Lust used to be the secret pull that brought her through the city, that opened it up to new delights. It was lust that pushed her to follow the switch of hips and poom-poom shorts or the swaggering roll of a big dick walk that led her to friends and jobs and fights and parades and once a lady singing by herself on a beach. Her lust is the thing that makes this horrible, expensive, smelly place worthwhile. Without it, she is unfixed in this world. And I'll stop there.
I think I'm going to change the order slightly of the questions you're talking about, because I think that reading sets us up to discuss sort of what I felt was one of the thrusts of the story, the sort of like sexual frustration felt during the pandemic, but more than that, the loss of like intimacy. So I was curious how you thought of like sex for people during the pandemic, how their relationship changed to it. What did it mean to them?
I sort of thought a lot about, I guess, what happens when our normal ways of engaging with intimacy gets disrupted against our will. I mean, I think that's probably what was the most traumatic thing about the pandemic, is that there was this disruption that none of us consented to, right? And very few of us planned for. And, you know, when you are an adult sexual being, so much of your, hopefully of your, of healthy sexuality, I should say, is your decisions around your own desire, you know, following your own desire, figuring it out for yourself, you know, taking responsibility for your own desire, and to have that feel like it's taken away by something so far outside of yourself. It's so alienating and sort of strange. And we don't, I mean, at least people who I talk to, I should say, we don't really have like a way to explain it, or even to talk about it, or even to know what we're mad about, or who to direct the anger towards. Yes. Sort of like an angry, you know, desirous feel, but there's no real target to sort of put it to. And that's sort of part of the frustration, because you can't really say like, it's a law, or it's the man, or like it's the patriarchy, or whatever the things that normally sort of dictate when your desire doesn't work out. You know, it's like this big existential question that's blocking you, and it's so much harder to deal with in that case.
And it's interesting because it's almost like bodily too. I feel like every reference I came across to skin hunger just made me flinch. Like It was like a unfortunate over-identification.
Yeah, it's so strange. I mean, I am, I realize this term skin hunger was so interesting to me because the flip side of that is touched out. So I was writing this when I was I just had a baby, and talking to other people who had a baby, particularly my sister, who's also a writer. When she had her kids and they were babies, she'd always talk about being touched out, and she'd be like, "I'm so touched out. My capacity for touch is at its limit because I literally have like something living and breathing and kind of like holding on to me at all times." And we would have those conversations, and my life was so much different from hers when she was talking about being touched out. My life was sort of like being single in New York City, and I'd be like, touched out, like what are you talking about? I guess I was experiencing skin, like what we now call like skin hunger, like that term. And so the two, like flip sides of those things were always so interesting to me, and how quickly your body can sort of flip from one to the other, and make that decision before your conscious mind can.
Oh, yeah. And along those lines, though, there's a similar interesting dynamic with Nessa's roommate, Lori, where she has a live-in boyfriend who just moved in during the pandemic, as many partners did.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that scene where Nessa's listening in and just says something to the effect that, like, she can tell they haven't had sex. And I was curious what you wanted to show with that in, like, contrast to, like, Nessa's, like, sexual desire.
I mean, part of that was like just craft wise, she needs somebody to be jealous of, and Nessa, what would make Nessa jealous would not be hearing, two other people having sex in another room. That would probably make her be like, yay, life is beautiful. What would make her jealous is like to hear two people who could be having sex, not actively not doing it and actively actually really disliking each other's bodies. She's sort of like, how can you have this sort of like gift in your bed? How could you do that? And then the other thing is like that part has a line that I stole from a really good writer friend who has like a really huge vendetta against pandas and sort of always makes fun of them for not being able to have sex in captivity, and is sort of like, why do they still exist? Like if they can't figure out how to get it on in captivity, like why are we? It's obviously it's a joke kind of thing. I will make that clear to people listening, but he goes on these rants about pandas that I just really enjoy. So I wanted to include that line or that concept in the story somehow. So that's the other reason why that happens there.
Oh no, that's great because it shows like the different effects it had on everyone and their relations to their bodies and like their desires and what they could consent to.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then to pull it out a bit more, I was curious, why did you set the story in New York City? And like on that, it felt different from your other novels in the sense that I would phrase it as like the inevitability of history didn't seem to rear its head in the same way. So I was curious why that was too.
Part of it was that I just really wanted to write about modern day New York City. So I just finished a historical novel, Liberty, that was set in New York, but set in New York in the 1860s. And it was really fun to just talk about a setting directly and sort of just pull from just a whole other frame of reference of talking about a place. And then also I wanted to talk about, this version of New York City that as a writer and sort of like a person moving through the city in that way feels really familiar to me, sort of like the artist life, for lack of a better term, even though Nessa isn't, Nessa is an artist of life. She doesn't necessarily have like a medium outside of herself, but she is a version of an artist. And so I wanted to include that part of the city and all those sort of like observations about it that I collected over the years that I didn't feel comfortable writing about. Because, when I was started writing, there were sort of all these novels about New York City and Brooklyn and sort of like writing life. And it was like, it felt like a real cliche to want to write about that at all. And so like I actively rejected that when I was starting writing like 10 or 15 years ago now. I think now I'm sort of long enough at trying to write that it feels like I can sort of tackle that. And I don't really care that much about whether or not it's cliche to be writing about Brooklyn at this point. So,
Well, along those lines, it's it's the Brooklyn you don't see in sort of like celebrated contemporary novels. It's like the queer sex party, like writer scene. There was the coffee shop owned by the famous women songwriter, and then I can't
You get the
remember.
reference?
Yeah.
The legend of Fort Greene, yes.
Yeah. And like that was cool to see. So like was there any sort of like a reclamation of the idea of New York occurring there?
Yeah. I mean, I moved to New York many times before it stuck, but the final time that it stuck was when I moved in 2005. And so it's just really straddling that moment between sort of old Fort Greene, old sort of the people who I worked with and my sort of like my cousins, older friends, and like when I would go to like an older person's party, they were like the first Black gentrifier generation people,
Yeah.
who got in on the ground floor of like a brownstone in Bed-Stuy and sort of like made that whole scene happen. And so, but I was never a part of that because I was too young and too poor to be a part of that. I was just sort of like on the margins, sort of like watching that happen. And so I really wanted to sort of write about that space. Dancy Senna had a fantastic novel that came out a few years ago about it called New People. I don't know if anyone's read that one. It's great if you want to read it and if you're interested in sort of reading more about that particular Brooklyn milieu. But I really wanted to sort of explore that part of it.
Okay. And then along those lines of exploring New York, I thought, and I'll try to not be New York centric here, but there were a lot of like pandemic beats that were natural to the city that I remember, like the constant sound of sirens going by, the like roommate who moves their boyfriend in, and like how did you decide what to include and what not to include there?
I tried to go really, really personal and on the sort of really like micro level. So like the really sort of most affecting part for me to write was Nessa comes out of her house after she's told her roommates that she's going to this party and she knows they object. And she's watching sort of everybody on the street because it's summertime, but it's still sort of in the throes of the pandemic. And she's sort of watching all these little street scenes, like someone trying to meet a baby for the first time, but they can't actually go up the steps of the brownstone. So the family is like holding the baby up and someone's on the steps below. Or like she sees a couple who clearly have quarantined together. And so they're able to take off their masks to kiss on the corner. And so like, I just really wanted to keep the details really, really small and specific to Nessa's eye and to the things that she is yearning for, which is like she belongs to, before the pandemic has happened, she is a person who sort of belongs to multiple different, constantly shifting groups of sort of like friends, acquaintances, ex-lovers, whatever in the city. And she's always by choice been sort of like a loner in that. Like she's sort of like very happily moves between different worlds. And as I think what happened for a lot of us in the pandemic, it freezes all of that and you are sort of unclear about where you belong and where that your next sort of entryway is supposed to be within all those different worlds.
Yeah, and it speaks to sort of the shifting of what we needed during that time. Like there was that beautiful line with the couple you just referenced where she sees the two men kiss softly and she says something like she couldn't imagine, like that softness had previously not been of interest, but now there was like a yearning for it.
Mm-hmm.
So I found that like shift in desires fascinating, that you could capture it. And also because Nessa is someone who's so driven and filled with resolve and just such a badass.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was curious to see her almost undone in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, one of the craft problems or like things that I set for myself in the novel, in this short story, was to write a character who is not an observer, who is not sort of like set back, who actually drives action. because I just finished a project, Liberty, where Liberty does drive a lot of the action in the novel, but she's also an observer for large parts of it. Large parts of it take place when she's a child, sort of like watching adults. So she sort of is like sitting back and watching. And a lot of fiction, I will just keep it particular to myself, a lot of fiction that I write feels like it comes out in the first draft, often in the observer mold of a character who's less sort of like is watching other people do things. So I really wanted to write a character where you were in sort of you were deeply in their head, you deeply sort of understood their motivations, but they were the ones driving the action at all times. And that was really fun and really freeing once I sort of like just sort of let that part go. And because she drives the action so much, and because she is so driven, as you said, it meant that there was more of a palette to play with to give her sort of these other emotions, like a yearning for softness, or self-recrimination, or sort of all these other things that she gets to do underneath the surface of making these really big, bold decisions.
And did she take you anywhere unexpected? Like, did you at any point lose sort of like, or not lose control of the story, but did she take control?
Towards the end, I was trying to sort of figure out how to end the story for her and how to end it in a way. And I didn't want to give her a melancholy ending. And so she took it in a really sort of interesting way. And I wanted to have her both sort of understand the comedy of the situation that she finds herself in, and but not feel humiliated at the end of the story. And she did. I hope that it reads that she doesn't feel humiliated, that she actually sort of just is able to understand it as it's another night of her life unfolding, and by the end of the story, there's a chance of a whole nother night opening up for her as she sort of moves through her life.
And it does read that way. It reads excitingly. It like fits her.
Mm-hmm.
But then, so in terms of relationships, one of the things I found really interesting for Nessa was like the way she starts, class almost starts to filter into her sense of relationships with other people. So like there's that reference to Laurie's like fancy deli items in the fridge, and Nessa like weaving past it, or Nessa's boss Charisse, who like requires her, for the audience, sorry, this is definitely a spoiler, basically Nessa's working at a computer looking at Laurie or Charisse's living room while Charisse and her family sort of go around and maskless while their maid is wearing a mask. And so I was curious what you wanted to show about how class affected people differently in the pandemic.
Sure. I wanted to write about, I guess for Nessa, she's able to make a living and a life for herself in New York for so long because she's able to sort of find this pocket where she doesn't need that much money to actually exist in the city. And the things that she's getting out of the city is not to like build a fortune. The thing that she's getting out of the city is to live this really amazing life and to have these sort of encounters over and over again. And so when the pandemic takes all of that away, it really puts into stark question of like, what are you doing in this space in the city when you don't have access to those things? And just, I don't think you can write about life in a city like New York without writing about class, because one of the things that makes the city so great and so dynamic is that people of different social economic classes, we are side by side in a way that doesn't happen in a sort of like a different type of community. And the fact that you can be, especially if you're a transplant to New York City, the fact that you can be sort of in a milieu with a bunch of people and it only sort of slowly dawns on you as sort of like the years go by that you actually are really poor, and that person over there who you sort of like are hanging out with at the party has like a trust fund, like that. I think that is a moment of being like a young New York transplant that often happens where you're like, wait a minute, is that how you're living here? Because that's not how I'm living here. So like, I think that realization that happens and how that realization looks different in the starkness of something like a pandemic, where pre-pandemic life, you can sort of roll that off your back by being like, but I'm fabulous anyways. And during a pandemic, it's really hard to draw that bravado when you're really faced with those stark differences.
Oh yeah, because it's not just like your friend unexpectedly is able to buy an apartment. It's they have a maid cleaning their apartment during the pandemic. Yeah.
She's so Nessa has this friend Charisse who she's known since she's sort of gotten to the city, and they know each other from going to parties and stuff. And then Nessa realizes all of a sudden that Charisse has sort of used these parties to network her way into a really comfortable life. She's married a club promoter. They have the proverbial brownstone in Brooklyn. They have the really cute kids for Instagram, and the Charisse runs sort of like a nonprofit that Nessa works at and actually does a really good job at. But all of a sudden, Nessa sort of realizes that this person who she thought they were on the same trajectory has a completely different understanding of living in the city than she does.
And then along those lines, so one of the things which sort of piqued my interest, well, one of the many things, was there was that scene with the nonprofit she works with Charisse. They work with teenagers. There's this young girl, Fatima, and who essentially makes a poor decision, ends up getting COVID and goes to the hospital. And there's that moment where Nessa sends her the text, like, essentially, once you're out of here, we should have this conversation. But that combined with her sort of sense of responsibility for her older neighbors downstairs, who she checks on, offers to get groceries for, raised the question of, as she's so concerned for like the people around her, their health and safety, what could lead her to go to an orgy during the middle of the pandemic?
Yeah, it's really human, I think, to be someone who both can care for and understand how important it is to care for other people in your community, and just be so overwhelmed by how bleak our choices are right now that you make a not great choice. And one of the things that I thought about, I don't know that I thought consciously about it, but I realized that it is in the story. How we talk about COVID-19 and how we talk about quarantine and masking, it's all morality, right? It's become like, it's all a huge test around and judgment around morality for a lot of people. But when you actually talk to people about why they may not be getting vaccinated or why they may not be getting masked, I'm absenting from the very loud people who are like anti-vax. When you talk to like a whole bunch of other people, the question becomes much more murky for them, because sometimes it really is like, I actually really do care about my neighbors, but I'm not going to get the shot because I'm scared I'm going to be sick for 2 weeks and I can't take off work. Like, and that sort of makes this thing that we talk about in very stark moral terms, like you are a good person if you do these things, you're a terrible bad person if you do these other things. That, for me at least, makes it a little bit more murky, and it's in the murkiness that fiction really, really grows. So, and also I thought it would be more interesting. It's not as fun to read about someone who doesn't care about the world or anything and is going to an orgy, whatever. Nessa cares very deeply about the people around her that she wants to protect, and she does have a very strong sense of morality, but that's not going to stop her from going out and sort of making these decisions in her life. And she makes the calculation that all of us make, just at a grander scale. I make a calculation when I go into CVS about whether or not, when the mask is optional, whether or not I'm going to put it on that day. And most of the times I will, but if I'm like, I'm just going to get in there to get like a bottle of water, I may not put it on when I'm opening, the refrigerator or whatever. It's all these little constant calculations that we're making in this time period that are so invested with a sort of like sometimes false sense of morality that I really wanted to sort of explore.
Oh yeah, because there's an entire sort of like morality theater you can unpack there about what's performative, what's actually about caring for other people, and what we expect other people to do, and their responsibilities to us. It's all like living in a society.
Right, exactly. Like, I don't know if you remember at the very start of the pandemic, there was a lot of judgment about like whether or not you were staying home. This is when we thought we were only gonna be home for 2 weeks, right? And there's like a lot of judgment about like when you leave the house or when you didn't leave the house, without sort of like an understanding of like people are living drastically different lives for different reasons. They have to leave. So like, I wanted to sort of explore that part of it, I guess.
Well, along those lines though, so like, what does sex mean to Nessa? Why is this an area where like the moral murkiness sort of arises, where she'd go to an orgy?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think sex is a form of art for Nessa. You know, it's a form of her defining herself in like a very particular way. And it's how she understands herself, how she marks time in the city, how she relates to other people in the city, and how she cements and formulates relationships to other people in the city. And I really wanted to write a character in a literary fiction story, a woman character who has sex with very little guilt or sort of hand-wringing about any of it. And the complications that come up from her drive and desire come from sort of like heartbreak because she's still pining after her ex-girlfriend, or it comes from, you know, a misunderstanding and generational divide when she's sort of talking to this young guy at the party. But it doesn't necessarily come from her beating herself up over the fact that she wants to have sex or enjoys sex or likes a certain type of sex.
Yeah, there was a quote which I'm going to find about her relationship to sex. It's she made a promise to herself a long time ago that she would never feel guilty or bad about her desires. She would never be ashamed of a sexual adventure. And so, like, one, I found that completely aspirational. But two, I was curious how that rolled into the young guy you mentioned she has the encounter with at the party. She tells him this story, this sort of foundational story for her of like her first time going to a sex party, meeting this girl who she met her, I believe, at a protest, and then they set the plan to go to meet up. The girl gives her something which sends her tripping, which she wasn't aware of or planning on, but then it leads to this night, which she considers one of the best nights of her life. And when she communicates that to the young guy, he responds with something along the lines of saying, this was something she didn't consent to, she was roofied, and it's a flashpoint for Nessa. And so I was curious why she had that reaction, why it was almost a like strong aversion to it.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of saying, you know, I'm making the decision to never feel shame or always only feel, you know, excitement about this is that means Nessa is compartmentalizing to like a crazy degree to be able to do that, right? Because, you know, you can't like something like embarrassment or, you know, shame or like regret. Some of that, you know, is external programming, but some of that is just like a bodily response to it or an emotional response to an activity or a situation that you're in. But Nessa, the flip side of sort of her intense independence and intense sort of fierce-mindedness around this is she's not able to allow herself that moment of feeling those feelings of vulnerability around something. So she experiences this you know, this night, and to be able to get to the point where she's going to be proud of it and sort of incorporate it into her being, she has to sort of skip over the traumatic part of the potentially traumatic part of it, which is that she's with somebody who she should have trusted, who roofied her, and it could have gone really terribly wrong. And she's talking to this younger guy who picks up on that immediately, and when he does, she can't engage with it. And part of that also was I was so, you know, I am a much on the older millennial side. So it's been really interesting to see these conversations around sex and consent of the last couple of years, because I was a teenager when they came around sort of the first time in my life, like in the mid 90s, and sort of got like ridiculed out of existence. I feel like it's been memory hold for a bunch of people where they're acting like we never had these cultural conversations before, but we did like 20 years ago. And it's really interesting to me to talk to people who are like 10 or 15 years younger than me about sex and relationships, because they often have that reaction to people sort of like personal discussions. And people who are older than me, like people who are Gen X, I've had conversations with where they tell me absolutely horrifying things about their sex and dating life, and they laugh it off. They're like, "Isn't it hilarious?" And I've had the reaction that this young guy has had, where I'm like, "I don't think that was funny. Like, I think that's really actually messed up, and I can see its ripples in your life, but I'm just going to keep that to myself." But I think there is sort of like this disconnect where a younger generation who is really considerate and thinking really deeply about around sex and consent oftentimes can reinterpret these activities or these events that were never experienced as either abuse or unease by the people who actually experience them. And so there is that tension that I think oftentimes comes up when you're trying to sort of talk about that. Like I think a lot about how often there's like certain discussions over whether or not, a relationship between two people was appropriate or inappropriate, or if one person was 5 years older, does that mean like the person was taking advantage, and like all that sort of like murky stuff.
Yeah.
And a younger generation can be like really, really like that about it. And I think slightly older people can be sort of like, no, and also how dare you tell me that it was that way, because I actually experienced it and enjoyed it, and I feel like you're taking something away from me by saying that it couldn't possibly have been that.
Oh, well, that dynamic, it's so apparent. Like it is almost as though with like older generations, there's a sense of bad things happen. We live in patriarchy, shrug. And then like younger people are very much just like, we can discuss these out. So like it doesn't have to happen.
Yeah, it doesn't have to happen. And I mean, like, I think the flip side of that I think older people are so afraid of, it's so interesting, is like, if we talk about it too much, that means we're going to lose the spontaneity and sense of adventure that so many of us turn to sex and sexual spaces for. And I don't think that's true. Like, I don't think that's true at all. Actually, I think that's like a lie of the way that we oftentimes talk about consent. But I do think it's super interesting that seems to be like the fear that a lot of people have over younger generations sort of saying like, let's actually talk about these things in the open. Let's tease these out. Let's kind of like figure out what these dynamics are.
Which is like the work which has to be done. But it's, there's something about Nessa going to that orgy, which it reminded me of Darnell Moore's like No Ashes in the Fire, where he raises this question of like what drives like a young kid to like go out into the night to like try and find sex, to like try and find a man to have sex with. And like, well, the dynamics there are obviously different. It's that like that pull, that urge was just, it was so relatable. It was so understandable. And so like, because it's so a central part of her identity in a sense, having her narrative disrupted, it had to have felt like an attack. It had to have been foundational.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, like her whole understanding of herself is, I'm a person who's brave enough to have done this and to have enjoyed it. And in fact, this is the apex of my life in New York. This is what living in the city means to me, is this. And so to have someone say to you, actually, that sounds like it was a little bit abusive, like if that's her whole sense of self, you know, kind of feels like it's being attacked. And then also it's being attacked at this moment during, like we've been talking about, during the pandemic, when her sense of self feels like it's sort of being unmoored a little bit because she's not able to interact with people in the way that she's used to.
Oh yeah, not only unmoored, just like flayed and laid bare. Yeah. And then, I will say to our audience, I see we have a couple of questions populating. We'll be getting to the audience Q&A in about 5 minutes or so. So if you have any questions, please drop them off. If you're watching via the Facebook Live, comment on the thread. We'll pull the questions. And so with that out of the way, I think another point that was sort of interesting for me is, as a historical moment, since you are a historian, what did you feel was necessary to like capture in that moment of the pandemic? Was there something that was necessary to capture?
I think I really just wanted to capture sort of that that sort of like climbing up the walls feeling of living through it. And I think I wanted to capture that sort of like restlessness that would lead people to make certain kind of choices or decisions. Like, I'm so fascinated by how people will sort of explain the different decisions that they made about their lives during the pandemic, 5 or 10 years from now. And I think it's so easy to sort of forget the real, that real, it's not actually that easy, I think, because we feel it closing it again, but we that really a restlessness that forced so many of us to make decisions. If you had told us 6 months before you may be making this decision, we would say like, no, I would never do that, or like strange, or that sounds crazy, so I wanted to kind of get at that feel of it.
Oh, I know, that makes sense, because like there is this life altering sense of it. I don't think anyone's come out the same, and it's important to capture the ways all of our decisions have changed to adapt to this new world.
Yeah, for sure.
Out of curiosity, where do you think Nessa will be like post-pandemic? Is she still in the city? Has she fled?
Oh, yeah. She will never leave the city. She's still in the city. In my mind, she's post-pandemic, she's decided to quit her job that she's come to the realization that she doesn't want to work for this woman anymore. And I don't know, she's doing something really random, like, I don't know, selling cheeses in the farmer's market or some kind of she's picked up some sort of work like that allows her to keep living in the city, keep being around the city. But she would never leave.
Okay. No, relatable again. All right, so I think we can pivot to our audience questions now.
Great.
And our first one is from Mary, who asks, do you see yourself writing more about these characters or writing more stories surrounding the pandemic?
Right now, not really. I like sort of leaving these characters where they are and sort of feeling like they can have a life in people's imaginations, hopefully, afterwards. And I don't know that I'll write explicitly about the pandemic again. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think, not right now. I don't think so.
As a slight pivot off of that question, one point of curiosity for me was, it's been a while, I believe, since you've written a short story. What was it like returning to that form, and why was this the form to like tell Nessa's story?
This short story actually came out basically like in 24 hours. Yeah. Cool. I mean, I was thinking about it for a long time, but it was like purely one of those writing experiences where it was like, I just was sort of like obsessively typing it. And I assumed it was going to just be a fun sort of challenge for myself and a chance to sort of stretch my wings creatively, because I'd been working on a novel for so long. And I didn't really expect anybody to read it except for maybe some friends or something like that. And maybe, send to a literary journal or something. And then Scribd had reached out to me even before the pandemic to say, would you like to write something for us? And I was like, I think so. And then they, Amy at Scribd was just so persistent. And I finally said, like, I have this thing. I don't even know if you would want it. It's like really different from most of the things I work on. It's not, a personal essay. It's not a historic essay. It's not a novel. It's not any of those things. It's I don't know if you can use this. And luckily they said, yes, we're going to run with it and go with it. So it came and in a place, I was writing it at the start of last summer. It was a really sort of like way to escape from a lot of things, to write it and just to recapture some creative momentum.
Okay. It is lucky. It was a great story. And then our next question is, which I think you've touched on a bit, but what was your inspiration for this story? Is it something that you experienced or viewed? And
so I had even before the pandemic, like a year before before the pandemic happened, I was talking to a friend and we were talking about a friend of a friend, and he told me the story about her, about how she'd shown up to the sex party walked in, looked around, realized it was in the exact same place where she'd been to a sex party 20 years before when she first moved to New York. And we sort of were like, oh my God, that is like both hilarious and tragic and all at once. Can you sort of imagine that? That's so funny. And I was just so taken by that. And I was thinking about it for a long time. And I told a couple different people, like, I really want to write a short story about this. And I was just sort of like thinking about it, like, what would it be? What would it be? Then the pandemic happened. I was doing novel edits. Novel edits finally ended like at the beginning of the summer, a summer of 2020. And then I sort of like sat down and was like, okay, I think I'm ready to do this thing that I've been sort of like formulating and thinking about. I think I can actually sit down and write it out. And then once I sat down and write it out, it came very quickly. But the idea was from this sort of like idea of walking into, which I think once you live in New York long enough, it happens. You walk into a space and you're like, oh my God, I was here 5 years ago. And what has happened in my life to change since then? Probably nothing. Oh no, whatever. Like your mind goes through that whole thing. And I just really wanted to sort of capture that part of it.
It can be very stark. Like, yes. As on a slightly different note, we have a question from Aaron Thompson, who asks, do you think the restlessness of thwarted desire during the pandemic is similar to the restlessness of early parenthood?
I don't know. That's a really interesting connection. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like maybe I don't know. My early parenthood months were such a blur. I can't even really like parse that out. But I think that is such an interesting connection for sure.
Yeah, maybe the pivot off of it might be, so in the need to like the thwarted desire for touch, how that would butt up against when like the sort of, and this isn't the case for everyone, but like shortly after giving birth, the like lack of sexual desire, like how those two might contrast, because in both there's almost like a alienation of your body or like what your body was.
Yeah. I think that's part of it. I think for sure that's part of it. Yeah.
All right. And our next question is, will you continue to write short stories? Or are you more interested in the longer format of the novel? Followed by, are you already writing your next novel?
Right now I'm sort of like figuring out what to do next. I have a short story that I'm working on like slowly but surely, but it's it's hard to muster the creative energy for it as life and work and stuff takes over. I think the reason why Orgy came so quickly was because it was like a rare moment of time where I'd handed in the book and I didn't have a day job. Really, I just like had this really rare space of time where I was not working on anything else. So it was just like, all creative energy could go there. And right now it's very different. So I'm long-winded way to say that I'm working on some short stories right now that feel a lot of fun to work on because it's a little bit more contained than a novel. And yeah, novels will come too, I assume. So
well, as another pivot off of that, as like an exercise of your craft, do you feel which feels more like exercise, the novel or the short story?
Oh, they both are in different ways. A short story you can answer or explore a craft question in a really specific sort of like contained space. And a novel is sort of a way to figure out how to knit all these sort of various interests and asides together into something that's going to be coherent to another person's brain. So.
And our next question is from Angela, who asks, was it fun writing about sex? Was there anything that made you blush as you were writing it?
Oh yeah, it was super fun to write about sex. It was really fun to figure out how to write just really directly about sex. So there are sex scenes in Liberty, but Liberty's voice is, that of like a 19th century, upper middle class young woman. So like, there's definitely writing that references sex and and her sexuality, but it's all, you know, very poetic. So it was really fun to write in much more direct language about it.
And then on the like subject of that, or like as a slight pivot, I mean, did you know going into the story that Nessa would be queer, that you'd be exploring queer spaces and like describing queer sex? Like, I think like if you're not reading like Eileen Miles, you're gonna be like, "What's fisting?" Like you know. So like, was that fun?
That was really fun. I mean, I wanted her to. It made sense for her to be queer because of her age and her particular way that she was relating to sex. It made sense that she would be a queer woman versus a straight woman. And it also just meant that she could have more to describe too. And it also meant that the dynamics she was having within those spaces of like communal sex are going to look a lot different than if it was, you know, like a straight club versus a queer club. And because it's a queer club, it means that like a lot of that stuff around like, you know, a danger or like, you know, weird straight guy messing up the party is not doesn't have to be a part. Focus on the fun. You don't have to focus on, you know, the creeps. So that part made it fun. So
well, does it just bring up like a interesting point of where when she walks in to the party where the orgy's happening, it's a lot of dudes.
Right. Yeah, yes. Yeah. So that was like another friend was telling me about when she went to a party and she knew the people who were running it were possibly furries. So she went into a lot of effort to make this beautiful costume, and then she showed up and it was just like a bunch of guys who didn't try. And like I found that also extremely funny. You know, we laughed about it, like and you know, just like walking in and being like, okay, I guess this is not the party that I thought it was, like walking out. So I just really thought that was so funny and wanted to include that in there as well.
I will not name the animal head used because I think it's such a perfect detail, but it had me dying. Like I was just dead.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then we have another question from Dana who says, and it's a similar question to the pivot we had earlier, like where do you see Nessa today? But I think the interesting note is she concerned about the Delta variant? And sorry, no offense, Dana. The entire question is interesting. Is she concerned about the Delta variant and how it might once again bring on restrictions? And so the pivot to like bring it a bit out is, what would another lockdown look like to Nessa? Like, what are her senses of responsibility? What does survival during that look like for her?
I think that's a great question. I think for her, it looks like trying to build these connections that she felt were missing in the first lockdown, and trying to sort of actively figure out how to create new connections for herself. So if there's one thing about this character, it's that she's a character of action, and one of the things that's so frustrating to her, like one of the tensions that she's going through in this story is that, you know, in any other situation, if she had this really annoying roommate and the boyfriend coming over all the time, she'd just say, "Get the fuck out of my house." But she can't say that because it's, you know, it's quarantine. She can't kick them out. Like, where are they gonna go? So like she is the type of person who probably like around now she would be doing the calculations of, okay, if we're gonna go into lockdown in September, can I tell these people to get out now? And like, who else could I take to get to take over their room so that I don't have to live through quarantine with these people again? Like she's already probably calculating, making the plans, trying to make striving stuff to make sure that her second lockdown does not look like her first.
Yeah, like how do I convince them to break up, but make it seem like it's just
exactly what can to drive these two apart. Yes. Yeah.
Well, and I think we have time for just one last question. So let me just pivot to check on the Facebook. Okay. So one of the questions is, what does sexual self-care look like? Which I think we could extend to, like, what does sexual self-care look like for Nessa in a moment where her body's just sort of alienated from her?
Yeah. I think for her, it looks like you know, reminding herself of the possibilities of desire and connection that are around her. I think one of the things that she's struggling with is how much living in sort of the pandemic has really sort of like even killed off the imagination or the sense of possibility. You know, that sense of possibility can carry you a long way when you aren't actually actively having sex with anyone else. You know, the idea that you can sort of like still hold on to, like, I might meet someone tonight, or I might see some, or I might make eyes at somebody on the street, or I might flirt with that guy over there. Like that can carry you for a long time through periods of sort of like being alone when you don't want to be. And the fact that she's not able to sort of have those interactions is what's really driving her to distraction. And so I think for her, the self-care looks like creating as many places where she can still feel like those possibilities could happen. Whether that means she decides she's gonna walk around the city more, or she's gonna take the bus more often, or she's gonna, you know, it's for the rest of the summer, she's just gonna bring her blanket out into the park and she's gonna sit there in her mask and try and make eyes at anybody who walks by, you know, whoever walks by, you know, like whatever. All those things are how she's gonna try and keep that sense of possibility open to herself.
Okay, no, like cruising, you can just live in possibility and just like fantasy after fantasy.
Yes.
Yeah. Which apparently is the best note for us to end on.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you for the past hour. Like, honestly, it's been truly wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much to the Strand for hosting this, and for you for stepping in. These are wonderful questions, and thank you to everybody who came as well. Like I said, I'm just bowled over that so many people are still willing to sort of come to these virtual events, and I just really appreciate it.
On that note, thank you to our audience. If you haven't read Orgy, within 5 minutes after the end of this event, you're going to receive a link to a free 60-day trial for Scribd, and you can download it right onto your iPad. You can print it out if you still love books physically like I did.
There's also an audio version that's really wonderful. Yeah, you should check it out.
Oh, did you read the audio yourself as a quick final question?
I did not. Elaine, I'm always mispronounce her last name, but you know, she was editor of Teen Vogue.
Welteroth?
Thank you. Yes.
Yes.
She read it. She did a fantastic job. I recommend listening to the audio version if you are interested.
I will be listening to that on my phone on the way home. Yeah. And on that note, thank you everyone and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.